I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes.
Well, welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining the podcast. This week, we are continuing our theme of forgiveness, and my guest today is Marina Cantacuzino. She's an award-winning journalist, she's an author, and she's a broadcaster. And in 2003, as the world prepared for war in Iraq, Marina felt compelled to ask a different question. What happens when people who have suffered violence or injustice, what happens if they choose forgiveness instead of revenge? And that question became the foundation of the Forgiveness Project. It's a UK-based non-profit. It's independent of politics or religion, and it collects and it shares real-life stories from both victims and perpetrators of crime, violence, and conflict. And for over 20 years, Marina has created spaces where these restorative narratives can be heard, stories that don't provide easy answers, but I think they confront the messy, sometimes complex, even perhaps mysterious nature of forgiveness. And her work has brought together many different voices, like Azim Khamisa, who we spoke to a few weeks ago, who forgave his son's teenage killer, Joe Berry, who sat face-to-face with Patrick McGee, the IRA bomber who killed her father, Freddie Mutangua, who lost nearly his entire family in the Rwandan genocide, yet still, he chose not to live in hatred. And so through these stories, Marina challenges us to see forgiveness not as a weakness or as forgetting, but rather as an act of rehumanizing, of breaking the cycles of vengeance that can destroy people, can destroy communities alike. So today, I want to explore with her what forgiveness really means, whether some acts, perhaps I might ask, are simply unforgivable, and why she has devoted her life to documenting and amplifying these extraordinary stories. And Marina, great pleasure having you on the podcast, and thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Ben. It's lovely to be with you here today, talking about this tricky, complex, multifaceted subject.
It really is. And I think before we started forgiveness as a theme, I maybe had the same idea that it was just this one switch. You chose to forgive somebody and then you moved on. But it's not. Like, forgiveness seems to be an everlasting, complex journey that someone is on. Have you found that?
Yeah, mostly I have, but there are always exceptions. So there are those people for whom it is literally an epiphany, a moment where everything changes and their life is never the same again. But I would say that's very rare. I'd say mostly it's, use that very overused word, it's a journey. One day you might forgive, the next day, actually, you might hate all over again because something's triggered you and reminded you. And we are complex as human beings. And we may want to forgive and we may talk forgiveness, but in our heart, we may not always quite be there. Or it can be the other way around, actually. I'm fascinated by those people who refuse to use the word, who actually find it an affront. And yet they are probably the most forgiving people you've ever met. And they clearly have forgiven things.
Yeah, it's interesting because forgiveness, and we had a guest on a few weeks ago who talked saying forgiveness is not necessary. And forgiveness is kind of placed on people because religion tells you to forget, society tells you to forget, culture tells you to forget. And so maybe it's only when you are forgiving because it's going to help you or because it helps the society. Like, I don't know, is there a variation on why people forgive?
I think pain is the great motivator to forgive or getting through pain. So what I've found from the many people I've interviewed and talked to over the years is that they've tried other ways very often, because there are all sorts of ways we can deal with pain. We can go into silence, we can go into denial, we can self-medicate, we can self-harm. The ultimate end of that is suicide, or we can take revenge. And another way, just another method of dealing with the pain is forgiveness. And people often come to that going through various other stages and having tried various other things. One of the very first stories that I collected was Bud Welsh, whose daughter was killed in the Oklahoma bombing. And his first year after he lost his daughter, he turned to drink, he lost his job, his relationship suffered, and he describes really movingly, I think, he said, I went up every day to look at the bomb site. And one day, he said, I looked out over the bomb site and I thought, what I'm doing isn't working. I have to do something differently. So for him, it was a very conscious decision. The decision was to go and meet Timothy McVeigh, who was the bomber father. And from there, after a series of encounters and things happening, he reached a place of forgiveness. And he said he felt free. And I guess if you were to ask me what's the single thing that people describe it as, it is this sense of freedom, of having been released from the trauma and the rumination and the constant either self-blame or blaming others that can just corrupt and corrode one's life. And I also would say that many people, for them, a period of anger, a period of silence or whatever it is very important. It's just when it gets stuck, when people get stuck in these states, it becomes unhelpful and it exacerbates suffering. And that's when people are looking for something different. And forgiveness is just another way of dealing with harm.
But once someone has decided, just in that case, with the Oklahoma bomber, you've decided, you've tried, anger hasn't worked, you've lost your job, you've ended up, in a pretty bad place. But just deciding that you think forgiveness is next isn't the same as actually being able to forgive. Like, there's one idea of just having the idea of forgiveness, but I suppose what is so difficult, have you found that it's actually how you really feel, not just the idea of forgiveness, but how you actually can release it from your heart?
But I think you line yourself up for it. That's what people tend to do. And then you take a step, and it may be a conscious decision. It may be something that you want to explore and that you set yourself tasks and goals. Because people are often coming to me and asking me about how can I forgive? So there is something that people want to do and want to learn how to do. But equally, it can just emerge. It can be triggered. It can come from having tried everything else, or from something you hear or something you see. Another, one of the more recent stories I had, Figan Murray, I don't know if you know her. Her son was killed in the Manchester Arena bombing, suicide bombing there. And her forgiveness came 2 weeks. She was very specific about it after the bombing. And she said before, I always thought forgiveness was really lame. That's the word she used. It wasn't relevant to me. She never thought of it. 2 weeks after the bombing, she picked up The Guardian, and on the front page was a story of another bomb. There were a lot of bombs in the UK around that time. And there was one in a mosque here in London. And the imam had protected the guy. It wasn't actually a bomb. I think he was in a vehicle and trying to run over.
That's right, North London, I remember.
Yeah, North London, Finchley.
Yeah.
And the imam and a few of the congregation, Muslim men, protected the man who'd been trying to kill them. And she was so moved by this image on this paper that she said from that moment on, she realized that forgiveness was her way forward. It was her vehicle to stay within her humanity. So, and that's another way that people often describe it, I don't want to be like them. I don't want to be hateful like them. I don't want to be cruel like them. I've got to do it differently for my own sanity, for my own sake, for the people around me. So that's what I found people mostly describe it in those sort of ways. But it is important to say, Ben, that the reason I've carried on in this work for 20 years is that I learned so much. And it's always a new perspective. It's always couched in new language, or no one experience is the same as another.
I suppose I want to ask why you, in 2003, you began the Forgiveness Project. And I think it really does, even just having a place where people can talk openly about forgiveness, presumably leads other people to forgiveness. And can you take us back to 2003, first of all, and why you decided to focus on forgiveness? Why then? Was there a personal conviction that led you to start?
Well, it wasn't really. I never planned any of it. I was a freelance feature writer, journalist. I was the main breadwinner. I had 3 children. And I just went to, the Iraq War was imminent, and I went on the Peace March in London. And it sort of politicized me in a way that I just felt so clear in my mind that the harder you come down on people, the more they regroup and reemerge in a more resistant and angry way. And it felt so wrong what we were doing, and I felt so angry. I mean, I actually think that the Forgiveness Project grew out of my anger in a weird kind of way. But then, of course, the invasion of Iraq happened, and I thought, well, what can I do? I've got a small voice as a journalist. And I had 4 years before put on an exhibition called One in Four. It was about mental health. And it was just very journalistic in its form. I worked with a photographer, he took the portrait photographs, and I collected the interviews and wrote it up in first-person testimonies. And I thought, I want to do the same. I don't know quite how I landed on forgiveness, because it could have been empathy, if you like, or compassion, or reconciliation. All those things fascinated me. It was countercultural, counterintuitive. At the time, people were banging on about tit-for-tat revenge. They still are today. And I just wanted to find a different sort of stories. And that's where it started. And I think I landed on forgiveness because I felt it was, and I was right, the most contentious, the most difficult, the most complex, the most, it's just hard to grasp, slippery. And I thought I'll understand it better if I find people, lived experience, who can explain it to me, because that's how I learn. And I know also that that's how other people learn as well, because stories stick, whereas facts fade. And people walk in the shoes of others when they hear their stories and they understand things better and have more clarity. So then I just spent a year looking for these stories, a very private project. Had no idea what would happen to them, because I was doing some traveling at the time with this photographer. And so wherever we went, we just said, let's see if we can find some of these stories which focus, you mentioned restorative narratives, I think, on the restorative stories. That's how I come to call them, because they're stories that are about repair and recovery, which focus on empathy, compassion, and forgiveness from both the perpetrator and the victim survivor point of view. That's what happened. And that then became an exhibition called The F Word. And it was so successful, it took my life in a different direction.
More of our conversation right after this.
Yeah, it's interesting because if your response to something terrible happening is anger and revenge rather than forgiveness, then you just become the same thing that hurt you. And you've talked also about perpetual conflict. We see it in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, for example. And if there is no forgiveness, if it is just anger and revenge on both sides moving forward, there can be no solution. There can be no end to the pain.
But the timing has to be right. So I think in the midst of violent conflict, whether it's between two nations or siblings, people are just hell-bent on survival and on destroying the other. And it's not the right time to talk of forgiveness. I think forgiveness is part of repairing, about mending broken hearts and fractured relationships. So I think you have to, like when we talk about the conflicts that are so hot today, there will be individuals in there forgiving because that's what they've been taught, that's their faith, or that's what they need to do for themselves. But as a public discourse, it's extremely problematic, I think, to have it.
In fact, I think I asked Azim this a few weeks ago, and I used the example of Ukraine and Russia. And he was saying, when there is a peace deal there, then everyone can start forgiving. But at the moment that one country is invading your country and taking over your territory and your towns, forgiveness is impossible.
Yes.
And so, but say Israel-Palestine, if there's a perpetual conflict, at what point, how can you interrupt that? When can forgiveness begin?
Well, the way we've talked about forgiveness within this context has been to share the stories that we've worked with for 20 years that belong to organizations or come out of organizations like the Parents Circle, bereaved families on both Palestinian and Israeli sides, or combatants for peace, who still operate, who still talk, who still share their stories, even though the climate is so toxic now and they get attacked and we get attacked if we, because people want you to take both a side. And if you're talking about pain on both sides, you're quickly roundly attacked. So I understand why people stay silent often with these very difficult situations. But I think I think you can talk about forgiveness, but it has to come from personal experience and lived experience.
It's interesting because you said that what led to you beginning into the world of forgiveness was the invasion, or when troops went into Iraq, and you politicized you. But the Forgiveness Project is deliberately non-religious, non-political.
It is true. But of course, it's almost impossible, isn't it, to be? And I was also pulled up about the non-religious because someone said to me, you know, all these stories are so spiritual. There's something so intensely spiritual about forgiveness that you can't say. I used to say, you know, I wear it like a badge of honor, really, because there was so much out there about forgiveness and Christianity particularly. I wanted to really separate ourselves from that. And I felt it was exclusive in some way, and that people would feel you have to be religious or have a faith in order to forgive. So I used to say we were gristily secular, but then one of our storytellers, Marion Partington, whose sister was killed by serial killers, Fred and Rosebery West, who is herself a deep, thoughtful woman who's taught me a lot about forgiveness. She says, no, you're wrong. She said, read the stories that you've collected. In every one, there's a spiritual thread. And I thought that was interesting.
But even if you look at Christianity, I mean, Sodom and Gomorrah, no forgiveness there. You know, the rainfall and the floods that led to Noah's Ark, no forgiveness there. So even in religion, I think you have both sides.
Yeah, you do. But I think Jesus is on the cross, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, holds strong, really. And I do know people who have felt obliged to forgive because of their faith, and that hasn't been helpful. So it's been like premature forgiveness, and they've had to find it another way. And I think, you know, one thing that I've been very clear about, or one thing I learnt very early on, was that what I didn't want to do was present these stories as heroes, if you like, to use that word, because I didn't want people to feel that they failed in some way if they couldn't forgive. I thought that was so counterproductive. And in some respects, forgiveness then becomes a kind of tyranny. So I've been careful that the stories are nuanced and complex, and what they certainly don't do is amplify revenge and hatred and grievance, but they look at forgiveness from many different angles. And so one of the stories, for instance, is Rami Alahan, who's a member of the Parent Circle, the Israeli-Palestinian group. His daughter was killed in a suicide bomb. And he said, I do not forgive and I do not forget. But the boy who killed my daughter was a victim, grown bitter from hatred and shame and poverty. So his journey was around understanding and about building bridges and about not hating, but he couldn't bring himself really to use the word forgiveness. He found it not a helpful word for him. And there's quite a few. Jo Berry, you mentioned her before. Her father was killed in the Brighton bomb. She's increasingly moving away from the word. She doesn't find it helpful. Yeah, I find this fascinating. Just yesterday, I was talking about doing some funding, putting in a big funding bid with an academic institute. And they were saying, well, I think we should try and leave the word forgiveness out of it. It's not helpful. We're working in a theatre in London with a play about restorative justice, and we're dealing with all the post-show discussions for it. The Forgiveness Project is. And we've been sort of told, try and leave the forgiveness word out of it. So I've found this fascinating. This has been always the way. For 20 years, this has been the case. People love this word and they hate it.
Why do they want to leave the word out?
They think it brings Christian connotations, that it has soft, easy, condoning, excusing. You know, they see only the negative in that word, and they don't think it's gritty. And, you know, it's not going to help you get some money. It's not going to help bring in an audience. That's what they think. Yeah. We know, of course, at the Forgiveness Project, and we know it from the work we've done in prisons, that bring forgiveness into the word, into the room. If you bring forgiveness, the word, into a room, the level and the depth of the experiences shared and the conversations had are beyond anything we've experienced before, because everybody has got something to say about it, and they may have strong feelings about it, but then there's a reason why. They will have a story, they will have something they want to be forgiven for or something they have forgiven. And it's an extraordinary tool, actually, to use for conversation, but it's the paradox in a way. It's sort of like it's got two very strong sides to it, and people are inspired by it or they're affronted by it.
You believe that there are some acts that are unforgivable? And we've actually mentioned a few, but genocide or terrorism, the murder of children. First of all, do you think there are any?
All I can say to that is I know people have forgiven anything. So for some, everyone has their limits, everyone has their boundaries. And it's very interesting what some people can forgive and what some people can't forgive. Now, one of the most moving things I heard once was I met Eva Kor, who died a few years ago, but she was a survivor of Auschwitz. I met her at a conference in Germany where she was talking. She was like, she's a bit like Azim Kamisa in a way. She was like a forgiveness activist, I would call them. So they really flying the flag for forgiveness. But the way she described it was very moving. So she was forgiving the Nazis, about as bad as you can get. She was a survivor of Auschwitz as a child. She was a twin. She was experimented on by Mengele. And she said, the day I forgave the Nazis, I forgave my parents, who I'd hated all my life. Children expect their parents to save them, and mine couldn't. And then I forgave myself for hating my parents. And I always remember those words because she was talking about every layer of forgiveness there. And she showed me that actually, yes, you can forgive anything, but I don't think I could. I'm not sure you could, but it's possible.
I'm Benjamin Hall, and you're listening to Searching for Heroes.
Interesting, because you said it earlier, say there's, someone who has been Azim, the boy who killed Azim's son. Azim forgave him because he said that it wasn't the boy, it was the society and the lack of anything he had around him. But then, is that just passing on the anger? So it's not the boy, you can forgive the boy, but then is society the one that can't be forgiven? And if it's not society, is it someone else? Where does it stop? I mean,
it's very interesting because forgiveness is very interpersonal, isn't it? You forgive a person, it's much easier because you can look into the background of that person. You can say, oh, maybe they were wired wrong when they were born, which makes them want to get up and do such evil every morning. Or you could forgive. But when it becomes systemic and when it becomes an administration, I think then it becomes very difficult and problematic. And I agree with you. It becomes much harder to talk to. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, the activist, he talks about, like, for most African Americans, he says there's no place for a national conversation on forgiveness to do with slavery because too much is unreformed and unresolved. So this is what you get with human rights violations and where things aren't fixed, where it just continues. You get to the point where, no, forgiveness doesn't feel like justice. Without justice, I think the whole idea of forgiveness becomes diminished within those bigger contexts.
Isn't it interesting? Do you need to forgive for transformations like that to happen? Or do the transformations have to happen before you can forgive?
Yeah. And again, I think individuals forgive it's quite extraordinary what an individual is capable of forgiving for themselves.
Yeah.
But when you're talking wider group forgiveness, and there's, I find it harder to get my head around that because I see forgiveness as something so personal. But there's plenty of research that's been done into group forgiveness and where that can work and where it doesn't work. So I think the Forgiveness Project tends to collect personal stories, individual stories, and helps probably individuals more than groups.
You've sort of created this, you call it the forgiveness toolboxes with practical exercises. So I suppose, let's say for someone who's listening right now and they're struggling with the idea of forgiving, betrayal, grief, out of your toolbox, so where do they begin? What practical use would you give to someone?
Well, the toolbox I created with an academic called Masih Noor, and he was really interested in stories and came to the Forgiveness Project and said he wanted to analyse them. Because I've always been a little bit against creating a program to help people to forgive. But other people do it very well, and I didn't want to repeat that. I've tended to say, look at this story, or see how that person's done it. Yes, your context is very different, but he wanted to actually identify what were those tools, if you like, what were those skills, what were those qualities that people have. And the first one that we identified really was curiosity, that if you're not curious, if you're shut out and you've got very black and white, rigid thinking about life, you're less likely to be able to forgive. So curiosity seemed absolutely vital, because then the other key thing was perception change, that you have a wider lens on life, and you want to understand why people do things. So you move from why me, victim place, to why them. Again, that's around curiosity. And then really about finding empathy through understanding. Empathy is key, and that's the difficult one when you're talking about something extremely cruel. How do you find empathy? But people do. Even an iota of empathy they find. And then it's about letting go of that resentment, which becomes a heavy burden to carry, and moving towards forgiveness and or reconciliation, perhaps. But it's not necessarily in those stages. I made it seem like one thing leads to another. It doesn't necessarily wait. Well, but all those were ingredients within all the stories somewhere, that these little signposts really to, what it takes to forgive. But I don't think it's easy to teach. People will go on courses to learn how to forgive. And I'm sure they get some place towards it, but not always.
Do you ever feel disheartened? Because you focused for such a long time on forgiveness, on the Forgiveness Project, on inspiring others to forgive, on showing them how other people have forgiven. And yet, would you admit that we are living in a world that seems more divided, where there are more cracks, where forgiveness perhaps seems harder than it used to? I mean, do you think that we are perhaps heading in the wrong direction? And not individual stories, but it does feel as if we're living in a world that has further and further divisions.
I agree. I think we are. And I think we are becoming less forgiving as people, just in our opinions and the way we treat people.
Why?
Yeah. Well, I personally think social media has so much to do with everything, because everything is amplified. People have all the power and none of the responsibility. People can say what they want. Before, like 20, 30 years ago, when my father-in-law, for instance, was saying something really nasty about someone, he'd say it in his kitchen or down the pub. He's dead now, but if he was alive, he'd be putting it all out on social media. And I just think it amplifies and it inures people. And we've become hardened. And I think it's dangerous. And I think these stories are needed, and these conversations are needed more than ever, but are more difficult than ever to have.
Why aren't there more people, for all the people who go onto social media and write negative things, why aren't there more people going on there writing really amazing, uplifting things?
But they do. They just don't get the oxygen for some reason. It doesn't have the grit. It's very interesting. I've often thought, why? Because actually, forgiveness does bring headlines. If there's a very moving story, it'll get headline news and people will flock to it. People need it. They thirst for it. They're looking for light in dark places. But the other is much easier. It's a sort of gut response, really. I mean, I mentioned this play Punch that we're very involved with. It's about restorative justice, and it's based on the real story of a young man that we've worked with who punched someone who then fell, hit his head and died. And Jacob, whose story it's based on, was in prison for 3 years as a result. Then James Graham is probably the UK's top playwright, wrote a play about it. And we went to the launch in Nottingham. And I've never been into a theatre like that, because there were men who always go to see whatever play is on. They didn't know what to expect. They were in tears. There was standing ovation. I just sensed this huge need to hear this, which is a story about forgiveness and about restorative justice and about compassion. there was such a need and a thirst to see this story. The theatre, the piece of theatre sort of, sometimes theatre has such power, you know, it has more power really than reading a story in a book or in an exhibition. And I thought, contrary to what we've been talking about in a way, that actually these stories can find that oxygen if they're given the right platforms and they're given the right spaces. But it's hard, it's uphill, it's very hard work.
Yeah. Well, and you're certainly doing it for forgiveness. I suppose to finish up, if you could sort of leave listeners with sort of one thing, one truth that you've learned about forgiveness, something that perhaps surprised you, something that you didn't expect, something that might inspire others, what would that be?
I think maybe I realised that self-forgiveness was the hardest of all types of forgiveness. And I just found that from the stories that I collected about self-forgiveness. And I don't know exactly why that is, other than I think it goes down to a deep identity level, and that we want to be seen as morally sound, and that when we're not, ties into self-blame and self-hatred, and that it's very hard to forgive ourselves, and that it's a moral word, self-forgiveness. It's not about acceptance, which is just about self-love.
Self-forgiveness, you mean forgiving oneself for what?
For harm that we have done, either to others or to ourselves. But it comes from harm. It's more than sort of, it's not about self-development, or it's not about self-love. It's about forgiving yourself for the bad stuff you've done. And, you know, like regret is corrosive. So I think the stories I've collected around self-forgiveness have been some of the hardest because people have been so tormented.
Well, Marina, look, thank you so much for joining me. And I think this is a conversation we could have kept having for hours and hours. And I wish there was just a simple solution. You know, I wish we could all forgive, but I don't think that's ever going to be the case.
No, I think we can talk about it, though.
Yeah.
We've started doing forgiveness cafes, Ben, where people come and just sit and talk, share their stories.
What would you say? I asked about your forgiveness toolbox, but then would you say the first thing for people listening is just to go and see someone talk, just
ask questions.
Ask questions.
Yep. Because people need to be heard before they will listen.
The perfect way to finish. Marina,
Yeah.
What a great pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you, first of all, for listening to this podcast again. And I suppose I have quite a few thoughts having listened to that. For me, personally, I think one of the most powerful moments there was when Marina spoke about Eva Kor, the Auschwitz survivor who forgave the Nazis. But that wasn't the end of it. In doing that, she also then forgave her parents for not being able to save her. And then she forgave herself for the anger she had carried. I mean, what a remarkable and difficult journey that must have been for her. I think that story captures what Marina has spent the last 20 years of her life showing us. That forgiveness maybe isn't about just condoning the unforgivable. And I'm amazed that people can forgive things such as that, such as treatment in Auschwitz and the Holocaust. But maybe the point of forgiving there is not to condone those. It's just about reclaiming your own freedom. It's about reclaiming humanity. And again, she reminded us, as have the other guests we've spoken to about forgiveness, that it doesn't always come quickly. It certainly doesn't come easily. In some cases it does. With Azim, it came straight away. As soon as he learned about the death of his son, he felt the need to forgive. But in other cases, it can take a long, long time. And sometimes after something traumatic, as she said, it begins with anger is your initial response, or it begins with total silence. Or, she said, it can begin with self-destruction when you've gone through something so bad. And that, as she said, was the case of Bud Welch after the Oklahoma bombing. That led to self-destruction. But for him, he turned that to forgiveness when he realized that those paths deepen the pain. And so again, I think forgiveness becomes another way of surviving, another way of getting through the worst moments. What also interested me was Marina speaking really openly about the world we live in today. saying it is one that feels far more divided. It's less forgiving. It's hardened by social media, by polarization. And yet she continues this work on freedom, on forgiveness rather, because she believes that stories still have the power to heal. And again, you hear some of the stories she's talked about, whether it is the Rwandan genocide, the Oklahoma bombing. If you remember when we talked about the Sandy Hook killings last week, and you realize that those paths, if you can get through those, something so traumatic, then perhaps there's a way to get to almost anything. But the strength to do so, I'm not sure everyone's got that. Maybe the most striking point was that self-forgiveness, forgiving yourself, is maybe the hardest of all. And I've never thought about that. While we were talking to guests about forgiveness, I never stopped to think about forgiving oneself. You know, because that forces us to confront regrets, self-blame, things we didn't do, things we wished we had done. And it's interesting to think that maybe that is the hardest part of forgiveness sometimes. I mean, obviously not on a level of genocide or the Holocaust, but I think that's something that everyone has to go through. Forgiving yourself, perhaps, for things that you wish had been done differently. But again, you have to come back to the one idea that, look, if forgiveness is possible after Auschwitz, then it is possible absolutely anywhere. And that, as Marina said, that's where hope lies. So look, I hope this conversation has challenged you. I hope our theme of forgiveness over the last month has challenged you as well. It has me to think about what forgiveness means in your own life. Look, on a personal level to myself, I think all the time about forgiving the people who fired at our team in Ukraine, who took the lives of my colleagues. And so I think I've learned a lot. And to be honest, I haven't got an answer yet. I still think a lot about forgiving the people, if I ever knew who they were. But I hope that this has helped you. And I suppose go out and try every day to do something positive. And if forgiving is the real way of doing that, then I'd say go and do more of it. Anyway, thank you so much for joining the podcast, and I hope you join us next week.
Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.